My twin brother showed up covered in bruises. When I found out his wife's brothers were abusing him, we switched places and taught them a lesson they'll never forget. I was sitting at my kitchen table halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold when the knock came. It wasn't the confident rhythm of a friend dropping by or the hurried tap of a delivery driver. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, like whoever stood on the other side of that door wasn't sure they deserved to be there at all. I remember setting the mug down, the ceramic making a small sound against the wood, and walking toward the entryway with a vague sense of unease already curling in my chest. When I opened the door, I didn't recognize him at first. Not because he looked so different from me. We're identical twins, after all, and mirrors of each other in almost every physical way. But because the person standing there seemed smaller somehow, diminished, like someone had taken my brother and hollowed him out from the inside. His shoulders were hunched forward, his head slightly bowed, and when he finally looked up at me, I saw the bruises. They weren't the kind of bruises you get from tripping over a curb or bumping into a corner of a table. These were deliberate. A dark purple bloom spread across his left cheekbone, the edges fading into sickly yellow-green. His bottom lip was split, crusted with dried blood, and when he shifted his weight, I noticed the way he winced, the way he held his ribs like they might crack open if he moved too quickly. His knuckles were raw, scraped clean of skin in places, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not even when we were kids and things were hard. I stepped back without thinking, pulling the door wider, and he walked past me into the house like a ghost drifting through a life he no longer belonged to. I closed the door behind him, locked it, and turned to face him. He stood in the middle of my living room, arms wrapped around himself, staring at the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, until I finally managed to say his name. He flinched at the sound of it, and that small reaction, so unlike the confident, charismatic brother I'd known all my life, sent a cold spike of fear straight through me. I asked him what happened. My voice came out rougher than I intended, sharp with worry and the beginnings of anger. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sank down onto the edge of my couch, moving carefully like every part of him hurt. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his head hang forward, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, broken and raw in a way that made my chest ache. He said it was her brothers, his wife's brothers. I felt my stomach drop. I knew them, vaguely. Loud, overbearing men who dominated every family gathering, who spoke over everyone and acted like they owned whatever space they occupied. I'd always thought they were just assholes, the kind of people you tolerate because you have to, not because you want to. But this was something else entirely. My brother told me it started small. A shove here, a harsh word there, always framed as a joke, always dismissed as rough play between men. They mocked him at family dinners, belittled his career, called him soft, weak, not man enough. His wife laughed along with them sometimes, or worse, said nothing at all, just looked away while they tore him down piece by piece. He thought he could endure it. He thought if he kept his head down, stayed quiet, proved himself somehow, they would eventually leave him alone. But it got worse. They started coming to the house unannounced, barging in like they owned the place, drinking his beer, eating his food, and making it clear that he had no say in his own home. They watched him when his wife wasn't around, testing boundaries, pushing harder each time. One night, the older brother shoved him into a wall when he asked them to leave. My brother tried to stand his ground, tried to tell them they couldn't just walk all over him. And that's when the first real beating happened. They cornered him in the garage, told him he was embarrassing the family, that he needed to learn his place. The younger brother held him while the older one hit him, methodical and cold, like he was teaching a lesson. They warned him not to tell anyone, especially not his wife. They said no one would believe him anyway. And if he tried to make it a problem, they'd make sure he lost everything, his marriage, his kid, his reputation. They'd paint him as unstable, violent, a liar. And because they were her brothers, because the family always closed ranks around their own, he knew they could do it. So he stayed silent. He took the bruises and the threats and the humiliation, and he tried to survive. He told me all of this in fragments, his voice cracking, his hands shaking. He said he didn't know what to do anymore. He was afraid all the time, afraid they would escalate, afraid they would hurt his child, afraid his wife would choose them over him if he forced her to pick a side. He said he felt trapped, like he was living in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And he didn't see a way out. That's when he looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate, and asked if I would help him. Not in some vague, eventual way, but now, immediately. He said he needed to disappear for a while, to get away and breathe and figure out what to do next, but he couldn't just leave. They'd go after him, or worse, they'd take it out on his kid. He needed someone to take his place, just for a little while, just long enough to buy him time. And because we were twins, because we'd spent our whole lives being mistaken for each other, because no one outside of our immediate family could really tell us apart unless they looked closely, he thought maybe I could do it. He asked me to become him, to step into his life, wear his face, endure what he'd been enduring while he slipped away somewhere safe and tried to heal. I should have said no. Any reasonable person would have. The plan was insane, dangerous, and legally questionable at best. But I didn't say no. I looked at my brother, my twin, my other half, the person I'd shared a womb with, who knew me better than anyone else in the world, and I saw how broken he was. I saw the bruises and the fear and the exhaustion, and I couldn't let him go back to that house alone. I couldn't let those men keep hurting him, grinding him down until there was nothing left. So I said yes. I told him I would do it. I would trade places with him, move into his life, face his tormentors, and buy him the time he needed to escape. And more than that, I would make sure those bastards paid for what they'd done. I wouldn't just survive in his place. I would set a trap. I would gather evidence, expose their cruelty, and dismantle the power they held over him piece by piece. I would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. We spent the next 2 days planning. My brother walked me through every detail of his life, the routines and rhythms that made up his daily existence. He told me about his work schedule, his wife's habits, the way she liked her coffee, the things she complained about, the words she used when she was angry. He described his child, a bright, curious 8-year-old daughter named Emma, who loved a drawing and asked too many questions and deserved so much better than to grow up in a house filled with fear. He explained the layout of the house, where things were kept, which neighbors were nosy and which ones minded their own business. He gave me his phone, his wallet, his keys, and walked me through his passwords and PIN codes. He showed me the messages from her brothers, the vague threats and mocking jokes that filled his text history, and I felt my anger solidify into something cold and sharp. These men thought they were untouchable. They thought they could terrorize my brother without consequence. I was going to prove them wrong. We also talked about how to make the switch believable. The physical resemblance was easy. We'd always looked alike, down to the small scar above our right eyebrow and the crook in the way we smiled when we were nervous. But I needed to match his energy, his body language, the small gestures that made him who he was. I practiced the way he stood, slightly slouched, weight on his back foot, like he was always ready to retreat. I mimicked the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed, the way he avoided eye contact when someone raised their voice. I learned to flinch at sudden movements, to keep my voice low and apologetic, to make myself smaller. It felt wrong, like I was putting on the skin of someone who'd been beaten down, but it was necessary. If I walked in there acting like myself, confident, confrontational, unwilling to take shit from anyone, they'd know something was off. I had to be him completely, until the moment I was ready to strike. My brother also told me stories, memories that would help me understand the context of his life better. He told me about how he'd met Jennifer in college, how she'd been different then, independent, funny, someone who seemed to have her own mind. But after they got married and moved closer to her family, things changed. Her brothers had always been protective of her, borderline possessive, and they treated every man she dated like an interloper who needed to prove himself worthy. When my brother married her, Marcus and Derek decided he needed to be tested, needed to understand that he was marrying into their family and would need to follow their rules. At first, it was just little things. Showing up uninvited, making decisions about family gatherings without consulting him, treating him like a child who needed guidance. Jennifer didn't push back because this was normal to her. She'd grown up with her brothers running everything, making decisions, exerting control. She didn't see it as intrusive or inappropriate. She saw it as family being close. Over time, the dynamic became more toxic. Marcus, who was the oldest, established himself as the patriarch of the extended family, after their father had a stroke and became less involved. He made it clear that he expected deference, that his word was law. Derek, the middle child, fell in line and became Marcus's enforcer, the one who carried out his wishes and backed him up. Jennifer, as the youngest and only daughter, had always been treated as someone who needed protection and guidance. When my brother tried to assert himself, tried to establish boundaries or make decisions about his own household, Marcus and Derek saw it as insubordination. They started punishing him for it. Socially at first, making jokes at his expense, excluding him from conversations, treating him like he didn't matter. Then it escalated to physical intimidation and eventually to outright violence. My brother told me about the first time Marcus hit him. It was at a family barbecue, and my brother had made the mistake of disagreeing with Marcus about something trivial. Sports, politics, something that shouldn't have mattered. Marcus had gotten angry, his face flushing red, and he'd grabbed my brother by the shirt and shoved him hard against the side of the house. Nobody intervened. Derek laughed. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Marcus leaned in close and told my brother that he needed to learn respect, that he was lucky to be part of this family, and that if he didn't fall in line, there would be consequences. My brother had been so shocked, so humiliated, that he didn't know how to respond. He just nodded and apologized and tried to smooth things over. That was the moment, he told me, when he realized he was trapped. If his own wife wouldn't defend him, if the family would just watch while he was assaulted, then who would help him? The abuse became routine after that. Marcus and Derek would come over several times a week, and there was always some pretext. They were checking in on their sister, they wanted to borrow tools, they were just hanging out. But really, they were asserting dominance, making sure my brother understood his place. They'd criticize everything about him, his job, his appearance, his parenting, his masculinity. They'd take things from the house without asking. They'd eat dinner without offering to contribute. They'd stay late into the night, drinking and getting louder, and my brother would have to sit there and take it because any objection would be met with mockery or violence. Emma learned to disappear when they came over, to retreat to her room and stay quiet. She'd developed anxiety around loud male voices, around unexpected visitors, around conflict of any kind. My brother hated what his daughter was learning, hated that she was growing up thinking this was normal, but he didn't know how to stop it without making everything worse. On the third day, we made the switch. My brother packed a small bag with clothes and essentials, and I drove him to a friend's cabin 3 hours away, a place no one else knew about. The cabin belonged to an old college buddy of ours who had moved overseas for work and rarely used it. My brother had the keys and knew the alarm codes, and it was remote enough that he could disappear completely. He would stay there, off the grid, while I took his place. Before I left him, I made him promise to see a doctor, to get his injuries checked out, and to start thinking about what came next. Divorce, custody, restraining orders, whatever he needed to do to protect himself and Emma. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that none of it would matter, that the system wouldn't protect him, that her family would find a way to win. I squeezed his shoulder and told him to trust me. I told him I would handle it, that by the time I was done, Marcus and Derek would regret ever laying a hand on him. Then I got back in the car and drove to his house, my heart pounding, my mind racing through everything I needed to remember. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights on inside, warm and familiar, a picture of suburban normalcy that hid so much ugliness beneath the surface. I took a deep breath, grabbed his keys, and walked up to the front door. This was it. I was stepping into his life, into his pain, and I wouldn't come out until I'd burned it all down. His wife was in the kitchen when I walked in, standing at the counter with her back to me, chopping vegetables for dinner. She didn't turn around, just called out a distracted greeting, asking where I'd been. I forced myself to match my brother's soft, deferential tone and told her I'd run some errands. She made a non-committal sound, still not looking at me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this was normal for them. This distance, this lack of connection. She didn't look at him because she didn't need to. He was just a background presence in his own home, someone to be tolerated rather than noticed. I watched her for a moment, searching for some sign of the person my brother had fallen in love with. But all I saw was someone who had checked out long ago, who had chosen comfort over compassion. I asked where Emma was, and she gestured vaguely toward the living room, saying she was watching TV. I walked past her, my jaw tight, and found my niece curled up on the couch, tablet in hand, absorbed in some brightly colored cartoon. She glanced up when I entered, gave me a small smile, and went back to her screen. I sat down next to her, close but not too close, and asked how her day was. She shrugged and said it was fine, her voice flat, and I realized she'd learned the same survival tactic as my brother. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Stay quiet. It broke my heart. That first evening passed in tense normalcy. Jennifer made dinner, and we ate at the table in near silence. Emma picked at her food, and Jennifer scrolled through her phone, and I tried to blend into the background the way my brother would have. After dinner, I helped Emma with her homework, sitting at the kitchen table while she worked through math problems. She was smart, quick with numbers, but she kept checking the front door nervously, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. I asked her if she was okay, and she said she was fine in that same flat voice, the voice of a child who'd learned that expressing fear or discomfort didn't help anything. I wanted to tell her that things were going to change, that she wouldn't have to be afraid much longer, but I couldn't. Not yet. Any deviation from my brother's normal behavior might tip off Jennifer or alert Marcus and Derek that something was different. So I just helped her finish her homework, told her she'd done a good job, and let her retreat to her room for the night. That night, I learned the full extent of the nightmare my brother had been living. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the sound of a truck pulling up outside, the engine rumbling loud and aggressive. My pulse spiked and I glanced toward the window, already knowing who it was. Her brothers. The door burst open without a knock, and they walked in like they owned the place, loud and laughing, tracking mud across the floor. The older one, Marcus, was built like a linebacker, all broad shoulders and thick arms with a buzz cut and a permanent sneer. The younger one, Derek, was leaner but just as intimidating, with a sharp jawline and cold eyes that seemed to enjoy other people's discomfort. They headed straight for the fridge, grabbing beers without asking, and Marcus called out to my brother's wife, asking what was for dinner. She answered from the kitchen, her tone light and accommodating, telling them there were leftovers they could heat up. I felt a surge of disgust. She knew they were here. She welcomed it. They settled into the living room, sprawling across the furniture, and Marcus looked at me, his gaze sliding over me with casual contempt. He asked where I'd been all day, his tone mocking, like I was a child being questioned by an authority figure. I kept my voice even and said I'd been out running errands. Derek laughed, a harsh barking sound, and said I looked like shit. Marcus agreed, adding that I should get some rest, maybe hit the gym, stop being such a pussy. They both laughed at that, and I forced myself to stay still, to keep my expression neutral, even though every instinct screamed at me to tell them to fuck off and get out of this house. But I wasn't here as myself. I was here as my brother, the person they'd broken, and I needed them to believe the act. I watched them carefully that first night, cataloging their behavior, their patterns, the way they interacted with each other and with Jennifer. Marcus was clearly the alpha, the one who made decisions and expected others to fall in line. He spoke in declaratives, not questions, and he had a way of filling space that made everyone else shrink. Derek was his shadow, backing up everything Marcus said, laughing at his jokes and forcing his will. Together, they created an atmosphere of dominance and intimidation that was suffocating. Jennifer moved around them like a waitress in a restaurant, bringing them snacks and drinks, laughing at their jokes, never challenging or contradicting them. I saw the way she'd glance at me occasionally, checking to make sure I wasn't causing any problems, wasn't saying or doing anything that might upset her brothers. The message was clear. Keep your head down. Don't make waves, and maybe they'll leave soon. They stayed until after midnight. They watched sports, drank my brother's beer, and made themselves completely at home. At one point, Marcus got up and went into the kitchen, rummaging through the pantry like he lived there. He found a bag of chips and brought it back to the living room, tearing it open and eating handfuls while dropping crumbs all over the couch. When I got up to get a glass of water, Derek called after me, telling me to bring him another beer while I was up. I bit back the refusal that rose in my throat and did it, handing him the beer with a neutral expression. He took it without thanking me. And Marcus smirked, like my compliance was amusing. This was a test, I realized. Everything they did was a test, a way of reinforcing the hierarchy, of making sure I knew I was at the bottom. When they finally left, the house felt both emptier and heavier. Jennifer cleaned up the mess they'd made without comment, and I helped her, wanting to appear normal, wanting to blend in. She didn't say anything about their visit. didn't acknowledge the hours of invasion and disrespect we just endured. It was like it hadn't happened, or like it was so routine that it didn't warrant discussion. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could allow this, how she could watch her husband be treated like garbage in his own home and say nothing, do nothing. But I couldn't. Not yet. So I just finished cleaning, said goodnight, and went to bed in the guest room. My brother had warned me that he and Jennifer hadn't shared a bed in months, another casualty of the toxic dynamic in the house. I lay awake for a long time that first night, staring at the ceiling, processing everything I'd observed, the casual cruelty, the entitlement, the way Jennifer enabled it all. I thought about Emma, asleep in her room, growing up in this environment. I thought about my brother, 3 hours away in that cabin, probably unable to sleep, worried about what was happening here. I thought about Marcus and Derek, comfortable and smug, certain that they'd broken my brother completely, that he would never fight back. They had no idea what was coming. I pulled out my phone and started making notes, everything I'd observed, everything they'd said, the timeline of their visit. This was just the beginning. I was going to document everything, build a case so thorough that there would be no escape for them. And then I was going to destroy them. Over the next few days, I observed them carefully, learning their patterns, their cruelty, the way they operated. They came by almost every evening, sometimes staying for hours, drinking and eating and making themselves at home. They bossed Jennifer around, treating her like a servant, and she complied without complaint, sometimes even laughing along with their jokes. They ignored Emma most of the time, which was a mercy. But occasionally, Marcus would ruffle her hair too roughly or make some comment about her being soft, and I'd see the way my niece flinched, the way she retreated into herself. I started to understand how my brother had ended up so broken. This wasn't just physical abuse, it was psychological warfare, a constant erosion of dignity and autonomy. They made him feel powerless in his own home, and everyone around him enabled it. The first time they hit me, I was ready. It happened on the fourth night. Marcus was drunker than usual, and he'd been needling me all evening, making comments about my job, my appearance, my worth as a man. I kept my responses short and non-confrontational, but it didn't matter. He wanted a reaction, and when he didn't get one, he decided to escalate. He stood up abruptly, crossed the room, and shoved me hard in the chest. I stumbled back, catching myself against the wall, and he stepped closer, his face inches from mine. He asked if I had a problem, his breath hot and sour with alcohol. I said no, keeping my voice steady, and he shoved me again, harder this time. Derek laughed from the couch, egging him on. Then Marcus hit me, a sharp backhand across the face that made my ears ring. I tasted blood, felt the sting spread across my cheek, and forced myself to do nothing. I stood there, head down, hands at my sides, playing the part of the broken man they expected. Marcus called me pathetic and walked away, satisfied. Jennifer had watched the whole thing from the kitchen doorway. She didn't say a word. She just turned and went back to washing dishes. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the bathroom with my phone, recording a voice memo to myself. I described what had happened, the details of the assault, the witnesses who did nothing. My voice was steady as I spoke, clinical almost, but inside I was shaking with rage. Not at the pain. I'd been hit before, had been in fights, knew how to take a punch. But at the injustice of it, at the casual cruelty, at the fact that this had been my brother's reality for so long. I knew I needed evidence, not just for the legal system, but for myself, to remind me why I was doing this, to keep the anger focused and controlled. Over the following weeks, I built a careful, methodical record of their behavior. I recorded their conversations when they didn't know I was listening, capturing threats and insults and admissions of past violence. I took photos of the bruises they left on me, new ones that matched my brother's, and timestamped them. I saved every text message, every voicemail, every piece of communication that revealed their cruelty. I also started digging into their lives, learning about their jobs, their reputations, the people who enabled them. Marcus worked for a construction company called Apex Builders, where he was a foreman, known for being a hard ass, but also for cutting corners and intimidating workers. I started casually asking questions about his work when he'd come over, acting interested, and he'd brag about how he ran his crews, how he didn't take shit from anyone, how he'd fire people on the spot if they didn't do exactly what he said. He told stories about screaming at workers, about threatening them, about times he'd gotten physical when someone questioned his authority. I recorded all of it, every incriminating word. Derek was a loan officer at First National Bank, someone who presented a clean professional image but had a history of shady dealings that his family helped him cover up. He was more careful than Marcus, less likely to openly brag, but after a few drinks, he'd let things slip. Comments about loans he'd approved for friends even though they didn't qualify, about kickbacks he'd received, about times he'd pressured vulnerable clients into deals that benefited him. I recorded those conversations too, building a file that would eventually destroy his career. I also started building relationships with people who might help me when the time came. There was a neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, an older woman who lived 2 houses down and had always seemed kind but watchful. I made a point of talking to her when I saw her outside, mentioning in passing how stressful things had been at home. She gave me a long, searching look, her dark eyes full of concern, and said if I ever needed anything, I should let her know. She had that quality that some older women have, that grandmother energy that makes you feel like you can trust them, like they've seen enough of life to understand complicated situations without judgment. I thanked her and filed that connection away. At my brother's workplace, a mid-sized accounting firm called Patterson and Associates, I identified a coworker named Sam who had always been friendly, someone who seemed decent and observant. Sam was around my brother's age, with an easy smile and a reputation for being the guy who checked in on people, who noticed when someone was struggling. I let slip carefully during a conversation at the coffee machine that things were tough at home. Sam's expression shifted to one of genuine concern, and they offered to grab coffee sometime if I needed to talk. I accepted, planting seeds that I knew I'd need later. I was building a network of witnesses, people who would remember my brother's struggles, who would be willing to speak up when the time came. The abuse continued, escalating in small increments. They hit me more often, always when Jennifer wasn't in the room or when she was close enough to hear, but chose to ignore it. They mocked me relentlessly, called me weak, stupid, worthless. Marcus had a particularly cruel habit of comparing me to other men in their social circle, pointing out how much more successful or masculine or capable they were. Derek developed a game where he'd send me increasingly degrading text messages throughout the day, ordering me to do things. Have dinner ready by 7. Make sure there's beer in the fridge. Tell Jennifer I'm bringing someone by tomorrow, treating me like a servant in my own home. I saved every single message, screenshots carefully organized by date and time, building a digital paper trail that would be impossible to deny. They also started messing with the house itself, asserting ownership in physical ways. Marcus would rearrange furniture when he came over, moving things to different rooms, claiming he was fixing the layout. Derek would take things, tools from the garage, electronics, even clothes, and when I'd noticed they were missing and mention it, he'd deny taking them or claim I'd said he could borrow them. It was gaslighting, making me question my own memory and perception, and I realized this was something they'd been doing to my brother for a long time. I started taking inventory of everything in the house, documenting what belonged where, so I'd have evidence of their theft. I also installed a small hidden camera in the living room, tucked behind a picture frame, angled to capture the main seating area. It was a risk. If they found it, they'd know something was up. But I needed video evidence, not just audio. I needed footage of them hitting me, of them stealing, of the casual way they invaded and dominated the space. Marcus's violence became more calculated as the weeks went on. He started hitting me in places that wouldn't show as easily. Ribs, back, shoulders. He'd corner me in the garage or the basement, places where the sound wouldn't carry to Emma's room and he'd take his time. Derek would stand watch, sometimes recording on his phone, laughing at my attempts to protect myself. They made it a game, seeing how much they could hurt me without leaving obvious marks, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. Once, Marcus brought one of his construction buddies over, a guy named Tony, who was just as brutal. They took turns, 3 against 1, and when it was over, Marcus leaned down close to my ear and said, "This is what happens when you forget your place. Remember that." I remembered everything, and I recorded it all. The hidden camera had captured the entire assault, and I'd managed to keep my phone in my pocket recording audio. It was brutal to watch later, to see myself taking those hits, but it was necessary. This was evidence that would put them away. Emma started showing more obvious signs of the stress as the weeks went on. She became quieter, more withdrawn. Her drawings, which had been bright and imaginative, turned dark. Stick figures with frowning faces, houses with no doors, rain that never stopped. One drawing particularly gutted me. It showed a small figure, labeled me, standing far away from two large figures labeled bad men, with another figure labeled daddy, sitting on the ground with X's for eyes. When I asked her about it, sitting beside her at the kitchen table, trying to keep my voice gentle, she just shrugged and said she didn't like it when Uncle Marcus and Uncle Derek visited. She said they were loud and mean, and they made Daddy sad. She looked up at me with those big, worried eyes and asked, "Why do they come here if they're not nice?" I didn't have an answer that an 8-year-old would understand. Didn't know how to explain that her mother allowed it, that her father had felt powerless to stop it. So I just hugged her carefully, mindful of my bruised ribs, and told her that things were going to get better soon. I promised her, and I meant it. I took photos of her drawings, added them to my evidence file with dates and context notes. This wasn't just about physical abuse anymore. This was about documenting the psychological damage being inflicted on a child, evidence that would be crucial in the custody battle I knew was coming. Jennifer's role in all of this became clearer the longer I lived in that house. She wasn't just passively allowing the abuse, she was actively enabling it. I started paying closer attention to her interactions with her brothers, to the things she said and didn't say. When Marcus would make a cruel joke at my expense during dinner, she'd laugh. Not just a polite chuckle, but genuine amusement. When Derek would text her asking if her husband was behaving, she'd text back things like, "trying to," or "you know how he is," with laughing emojis. I found those messages one night when she left her phone on the bathroom counter while she was in the shower. I took screenshots, my hands shaking with anger, and sent them to my own phone before deleting the evidence that I'd accessed her device. She was in on it. She might not have been throwing the punches, but she was holding the door open for the people who did. I started documenting her role too. I recorded conversations where she dismissed my concerns, where she told me I was being too sensitive, where she suggested that maybe if I just tried harder to get along with her brothers, things would be better. One night, after Marcus had shoved me hard enough to knock over a lamp, I tried to talk to her about it. Once we were alone, I said carefully, trying to sound defeated rather than angry, "This is getting out of hand. Your brothers are—" She cut me off before I could finish. "They're just playing around. You take everything so seriously. They're family. They're allowed to tease you." I pushed a little further, asked her if she really thought it was okay that they hit me, and she rolled her eyes. "Hit you? God, you're dramatic. Marcus barely touched you. You need to toughen up." Every word was captured on my phone, which was in my shirt pocket recording. I was building a comprehensive picture of her complicity, evidence that she was an active participant in my brother's torment, not an innocent bystander. I also started digging into her relationship with her family, trying to understand how this dynamic had formed. What made her choose her brothers over her husband? I asked her questions, pretending to be interested in family history, and she opened up more than I expected. She told me about how her brothers had always protected her growing up, how they'd scared off boys they didn't approve of, how they'd fought anyone who gave her trouble. She spoke about it with fondness, nostalgia, like their overprotective behavior was romantic rather than controlling. She said that when she introduced my brother to her family, Marcus and Derek had been skeptical, worried that he wasn't good enough for her. She'd had to convince them to give him a chance to accept him into the family. But, she said with a sigh, he'd never really proven himself, never really fit in the way she'd hoped he would. The subtext was clear. My brother had failed some tests that her brothers had set, and now he was paying the price. She saw their abuse as his fault, as something he'd brought on himself by not being man enough to earn their respect. That realization made something harden inside me. Jennifer wasn't a victim. She wasn't confused or manipulated. She had made a conscious choice to prioritize her brother's approval over her husband's safety, over her daughter's well-being. She'd chosen the family she came from over the family she'd created, and she'd done it knowing full well what that meant. I stopped feeling any sympathy for her after that. Whatever happened to her in the legal proceedings to come, she'd earned it. By the 6th week, I had amassed a staggering amount of evidence. Hours of audio recordings, dozens of photos, hundreds of text messages and emails. Video footage from the hidden camera showing assaults, theft, and the general atmosphere of intimidation. I had witness statements from Mrs. Alvarez, who had heard the shouting and seen Marcus's truck at odd hours, who had noticed that my brother looked increasingly beaten down and afraid. I had testimony from Sam at work, who had noticed the bruises and the changes in my brother's demeanor, who had documentation of the days I'd called in sick because I was too injured to come in. I had medical records, too. I'd made a point of going to a walk-in clinic after one particularly brutal beating, the one where Tony had been involved. I'd claimed I'd fallen down the stairs, but the doctor had been skeptical. She'd documented injuries that were inconsistent with a simple fall, contusions on both sides of my ribcage, defensive wounds on my forearms, facial injuries that suggested I'd been struck multiple times. She'd actually pulled me aside and asked directly if someone was hurting me, if I was safe at home. I'd denied it, playing the role of the embarrassed, ashamed victim. But I'd also requested copies of all the medical records and photos they'd taken. She'd given them to me with a knowing look and a card for a domestic violence hotline. I'd thanked her and added everything to my evidence file. I also had financial records showing a pattern of theft and exploitation. Marcus and Derek had been helping themselves to my brother's money for months, making withdrawals from his account. They somehow had his ATM card, probably taken from his wallet during one of their visits, and charging things to his credit cards. When I started tracking it, I found thousands of dollars in unauthorized charges and withdrawals over the past year. I documented every transaction, cross-referenced them with dates when Marcus and Derek had been at the house, and built a timeline that showed systematic financial abuse. This was important because it established a pattern of exploitation beyond just the physical violence, showing that they saw my brother as someone they could use and victimize in multiple ways. I also started reaching out to people in their professional lives, carefully and anonymously at first. I contacted Marcus's employer through a general ethics hotline that Apex Builders had set up after some previous controversy. I provided specific dates and incidents where Marcus had demonstrated violent behavior or safety violations on job sites, information I'd gathered from his own bragging. I didn't identify myself, just framed it as a concerned citizen who had witnessed troubling behavior. I mentioned that Marcus had a history of violence that extended to his personal life, that he'd been caught on recording threatening and assaulting someone, and that the company might want to investigate before they faced liability. The hotline operator took detailed notes and assured me that the complaint would be investigated. I gave them just enough information to be credible, but not so much that they could trace it back to me. I did the same with Derek's bank. First National had a corporate compliance department that took ethics violations seriously, especially in the wake of various banking scandals that had made national news. I sent a detailed complaint through their anonymous reporting system, outlining Derek's questionable practices, the loans he'd bragged about approving for friends who didn't qualify, the kickbacks, the pressure tactics on vulnerable clients. I included screenshots of text messages where Derek had discussed these things, his words incriminating him in his own voice. I also mentioned that Derek had a history of violent behavior in his personal life, including assault charges that were pending, and suggested that the bank might want to investigate whether someone with such poor judgment and impulse control should be in a position of trust with clients' money. The complaint was flagged as high priority, and I later learned through mutual acquaintances that Derek had been called in for questioning by internal affairs. I was building a web of consequences, making sure that when everything came out, it wouldn't just be a matter of criminal charges. Their entire lives would unravel. Their careers, their reputations, their social standing, everything would collapse under the weight of their own actions. I wanted them to lose everything they valued, to feel the same helplessness and desperation that my brother had felt, to understand that there are consequences for cruelty. The 7th week brought a new level of cruelty that crossed a line I hadn't expected them to cross. Marcus decided that I needed to be taught a lesson in front of Emma. It was a Saturday afternoon and Jennifer had gone out shopping with friends, leaving me alone with Emma. I should have known they'd show up. They always seemed to have a sixth sense for when Jennifer was gone, when there were no witnesses they cared about, and Marcus and Derek arrived around 2 o'clock, already drunk even though it was early afternoon. They came in loud and aggressive, and Emma immediately tensed up, setting down the book she'd been reading and watching them with wide, frightened eyes. I told Emma to go to her room, trying to keep my voice calm, but Marcus told her to stay put. He said she needed to see something, needed to learn something about her father. He started with the usual insults, calling me weak and pathetic, but there was an edge to his voice that day, something darker than usual. He grabbed me by the shirt and slammed me against the wall hard enough that a picture frame fell and shattered. Emma looked up from where she'd frozen on the couch, her eyes wide with terror, and Marcus glanced at her with a cruel smile. He said, "Watch this, kid. This is what happens to men who don't have a spine." Then he hit me, a closed fist to the stomach that drove the air from my lungs. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, and Emma screamed. She ran toward us, crying, begging Marcus to stop, her small hands pulling at his arm. For a terrible moment, I thought he might hit her too. I saw the anger flash in his eyes, saw his hand twitch, and I lunged forward despite the pain, positioning myself between them. Derek, who had been watching from the doorway with that sick smile on his face, told Emma to go to her room. She refused, standing between me and Marcus, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking. "Leave my daddy alone!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "You're bad! You're bad men!" Marcus looked down at her, and for a moment, the mask slipped. I saw something in his face. Uncertainty, maybe, or the faintest hint of shame. But then, it hardened again. He pointed at her and said, "You shut your mouth and go to your room right now, or your daddy's going to get it worse." Emma looked at me, terrified, and I told her quietly, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain screaming through my stomach, to go to her room and close the door. She didn't want to leave. I could see the conflict on her face, but finally she ran upstairs, sobbing. I heard her door slam and lock, and I pulled myself to my feet, positioning myself at the bottom of the stairs so that if they went after her, they'd have to go through me. Marcus called me pathetic again, made a few more threats about what would happen if I kept acting like a little bitch. And finally they left, Derek trailing after his brother, both of them laughing like they'd just done something hilarious instead of traumatizing a child. The moment their truck pulled away, I went upstairs and knocked softly on Emma's door. She opened it, her face red and swollen from crying, and she threw her arms around me, sobbing into my chest. I held her carefully, my bruised stomach aching, and let her cry. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at me and asked a question that broke my heart. "Why don't you make them stop, Daddy? Why do you let them hurt you?" I didn't have a good answer. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father felt trapped, powerless, afraid? How do you explain that sometimes adults fail to protect themselves because they're scared of making things worse? I told her that sometimes grown-ups have problems that are complicated, but that I was working on fixing things and that she wouldn't have to be scared much longer. I promised her that Uncle Marcus and Uncle Derek wouldn't be able to hurt us anymore soon. She asked how I knew, and I told her to trust me. She nodded, wanting to believe, and I felt the weight of that promise settle on my shoulders. I had to end this. I couldn't let this continue for one more day. That night, after Emma was asleep, I reviewed the footage from the hidden camera. It had captured everything. Marcus slamming me against the wall, the picture frame falling, him hitting me, Emma screaming and running to protect me, the pure terror on her face. It also captured the moment when Marcus had looked at Emma with anger, when it seemed entirely possible he might hurt her too. The audio picked up everything he'd said, including the threat that her daddy would get it worse if she didn't go to her room. It was damning evidence, the kind of thing that would destroy any remaining sympathy someone might have for Marcus. That would make it crystal clear that this wasn't just about adult conflict, but about a child being traumatized and endangered. I made multiple copies of that footage, uploading it to secure cloud storage, and I knew it was time to move to the final phase of my plan. The next morning, I reached out to my lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Chen, and she specialized in domestic violence and family law. I'd contacted her a few weeks into the swap, laying the groundwork, having an initial consultation where I'd explained the situation and shown her some preliminary evidence. At that meeting, she'd been cautious but intrigued, warning me about the risks of what I was doing, but also acknowledging that if I could document everything thoroughly, I'd have a strong case. Now I was ready to move forward. We met at her office on a weekday morning, and I brought everything: my laptop with the recordings and video footage, my phone with thousands of messages and photos, the medical records, printed statements from witnesses, financial documentation showing the theft. all of it organized into clearly labeled folders and files. Rebecca went through it methodically, and I watched her expression shift from professional interest to genuine shock to what looked like anger on my brother's behalf. When she finished reviewing everything, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of domestic abuse I've ever seen. The evidence is overwhelming. We can absolutely prosecute this, and I'm confident we'll win." She paused, then added, "What you've done, stepping into your brother's life, taking this abuse, gathering this evidence, it's extraordinary. It's also incredibly dangerous, and I'm glad you're ready to end it now before something worse happens." We discussed strategy for the next 2 hours. She outlined the legal pathway: criminal charges for assault and battery, multiple counts since there were multiple documented incidents, restraining orders not just against Marcus and Derek, but potentially against Jennifer as well, given her documented complicity, emergency custody arrangements for Emma to get her out of that house and into my brother's sole care immediately, and grounds for divorce on behalf of my brother, with evidence that would make it nearly impossible for Jennifer to contest the terms or fight for custody. Rebecca explained that the strength of the evidence meant we could move quickly, that we could get emergency protective orders within days, and have Marcus and Derek arrested within the week. But I wanted more than that. I told her about my plan for the family dinner for the public exposure, for making sure that everyone who had enabled Marcus and Derek saw exactly who they were. Rebecca was hesitant at first, worried about the risks, about the possibility of violence if we confronted them directly. But I convinced her that it was necessary, that legal consequences weren't enough, that I wanted social consequences too. I wanted their reputations destroyed, their enablers forced to reckon with what they'd been supporting, their facade of respectability ripped away in front of everyone who mattered to them. Finally, Rebecca agreed, but on certain conditions. First, we'd coordinate with the police, making sure they were on standby nearby in case things escalated. Second, we'd get the emergency protective orders and arrest warrants ready beforehand so they'd be in effect immediately after the dinner, regardless of what happened. Third, Emma would be safely away from the house, staying with a trusted adult before any confrontation occurred. And fourth, I'd wear a wire during the dinner, recording everything as backup in case they tried to claim later that things hadn't happened the way we said. I agreed to all of it. We set a date for the dinner, 2 weeks out, enough time to finalize all the legal paperwork and coordinate with law enforcement. In the days leading up to the dinner, I prepared meticulously. I copied all my evidence onto multiple USB drives, made sure everything was backed up in secure cloud storage that Marcus and Derek couldn't access, even if they somehow figured out what was happening and tried to destroy evidence. I briefed Rebecca on exactly what I planned to say and show, and she helped me edit together a presentation, a carefully curated compilation of audio recordings, photos, video footage, and documents that would make it impossible for anyone to deny what had been happening. We timed it to be about 20 minutes long, enough to be thorough without losing people's attention, enough to be devastating without being gratuitous. I also coordinated with the police. Rebecca put me in touch with Detective Sarah Morrison, who worked in the domestic violence unit. I met with her at the police station, bringing my evidence, and watched as she reviewed it with the same shocked expression Rebecca had shown. Detective Morrison asked questions, thorough ones, making sure she understood the timeline and the context. She was particularly interested in the video footage from the incident with Emma, watching it multiple times, her jaw tight with anger. When she finished reviewing everything, she told me that this was a clear-cut case, that Marcus and Derek would absolutely be arrested and charged, and that given the severity and documentation, they'd likely be held without bail initially. She agreed to have officers positioned near the house during the dinner, ready to intervene if things turned violent, and ready to execute the arrest warrants immediately after the confrontation. I also made arrangements for Emma's safety. I talked to Mrs. Alvarez, explaining without going into too much detail that there was going to be a difficult family situation, and asking if Emma could stay with her for the night. Mrs. Alvarez agreed immediately, asking no questions, just telling me that Emma would be safe and cared for. I told Emma it was a special sleepover, making it sound fun and exciting, and she was delighted. She loved Mrs. Alvarez, who baked cookies and told stories and treated her like a beloved grandchild. On the day of the dinner, I'd drop Emma off at Mrs. Alvarez's house in the afternoon, ensuring she was far away before anyone arrived. I sent out the invitations to the dinner, carefully worded to sound genuine and conciliatory. I called Marcus and Derek personally, putting on my best defeated, apologetic voice, and told them I wanted to make amends, that I realized I'd been difficult and wanted to do better, that I hoped we could all come together and work things out. Marcus ate it up, his voice dripping with condescension as he said he was glad I was finally seeing sense, that it was about time I stopped being such a little bitch and started acting like a man. Derek was equally smug, making jokes about how maybe there was hope for me after all. I invited their parents too, Marcus and Derek's mother Linda and father Robert, along with Jennifer's aunts and uncles, some mutual friends, basically anyone who'd been part of the social circle that had enabled this abuse or turned a blind eye to it. I wanted them all there. I wanted them all to see. Jennifer was thrilled about the dinner. She saw it as me finally surrendering, finally accepting my place, finally giving up on the idea that I deserved to be treated with respect or dignity. She threw herself into planning, deciding on menu items, fussing over details, excited to show her family that her husband had finally been broken into compliance. It was sickening to watch, but I played along, agreeing to everything she suggested, acting like the beaten-down spouse she thought I'd become. Inside, I was counting down the hours until I could rip away the mask she'd been hiding behind, until I could show everyone exactly what kind of person she was. The night of the dinner arrived. I dropped Emma off at Mrs. Alvarez's house in the afternoon around 3 o'clock. Mrs. Alvarez gave me a long, searching look when she answered the door, and I had the feeling she knew this wasn't really just about a special sleepover, that she understood something significant was happening. She squeezed my shoulder, told me to be careful, and said that Emma could stay as long as needed. I thanked her, gave Emma a tight hug, and told her I loved her. She hugged me back and said she loved me too, and the pure innocence in her voice, the trust, made me even more determined to see this through. This was for her. All of it was for her. I went back to the house and started cooking, following Jennifer's elaborate menu plans. By 6 o'clock, the house was ready. Table set, food prepared, the hidden camera's battery fully charged, the projector I'd set up in the corner ready to go, and my phone fully charged and ready to record everything. I'd also been fitted with a wire by Detective Morrison earlier that day, a small microphone taped to my chest under my shirt, transmitting everything to a recording device and also to the police who were positioned 2 blocks away. I was ready. Everything was in place. All that remained was for the guests to arrive and for me to spring the trap I'd spent 7 weeks building. People started arriving around 6:30. Marcus and Derek came together as always, loud and boisterous, carrying cases of beer like they were doing us a favor. Jennifer greeted them with hugs and laughter, and they settled into the living room like kings holding court. Their parents arrived next, Linda looking elegant and composed, Robert gruff and distant and as usual. Jennifer's Aunt Carol and Uncle Mike came, along with 2 couples who were mutual friends, people who'd been at various family gatherings where I'd been humiliated and had said nothing. The house filled with noise and conversation, everyone in good spirits, completely unaware of what was coming. Dinner went smoothly, everyone eating and drinking and talking. I played the perfect host, making sure glasses stayed full, answering questions politely, being deferential and unobtrusive. Marcus made several jokes at my expense during the meal, and everyone laughed, including Jennifer. And Derek shared a story about a time at a family barbecue when Marcus had put me in my place, and people chuckled like it was funny rather than horrifying. I smiled tightly and said nothing, just kept filling drinks and clearing plates. Inside this, I was coiled tight as a spring, my heart pounding, adrenaline making my hands want to shake. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to wait for the right moment. After dinner, I suggested we all move to the living room for dessert and coffee. Everyone agreed, relocating to the couches and chairs, settling in with full stomachs and good moods. I served coffee and slices of pie, and once everyone had been served, I asked for their attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward me with mild curiosity. I saw Marcus smirk, probably expecting some pathetic speech about gratitude or forgiveness. Jennifer was smiling, pleased that her plan for a reconciliation dinner seemed to be working. Everyone else just looked politely interested, waiting to hear what I had to say. I walked over to the projector I'd set up in the corner, turned it on, and the first image appeared on the wall, a photo of my bruised face taken after one of Marcus's beatings. The purple and yellow bruises stood out starkly against my skin, my split lip visible, One eye swollen nearly shut, the room went completely silent. The kind of silence that's heavy and suffocating, where you can hear people breathing and shifting uncomfortably. I let the image sit there for a long moment, letting everyone absorb it, before I spoke. "I want to show you all something," I said, my voice steady and calm, nothing like the defeated, apologetic tone they were used to hearing from me. "I want to show you what's been happening in this house for the past year. I want you to see exactly who Marcus and Derek really are, and I want you to see what Jennifer has been allowing to happen." Then, I pressed play on the first recording. Marcus's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, telling me I was worthless, that I should kill myself, that I was an embarrassment to the family. You could hear the sound of him hitting me in the background, the unmistakable thud of fist against flesh. Hear me gasping in pain, trying to say something, but getting cut off by another hit. You could hear Derek laughing, that cruel barking laugh, egging Marcus on, saying, "Hit him again, he needs to learn." The recording played for about 90 seconds, and in that time, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. The comfortable post-dinner contentment evaporated, replaced by shock and tension, so thick you could cut it with a knife. I watched their faces. Marcus's smirk had vanished instantly, replaced by shock that quickly morphed into rage. His face flushed red and he started to stand up, but his father grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, hissing at him to sit still. Derek looked panicked, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for an escape route. Jennifer had gone pale, her mouth hanging open, one hand pressed against her chest. Linda, Marcus and Derek's mother, had tears in her eyes, her face a mask of horror. Robert looked confused and then angry, but I couldn't tell yet if the anger was directed at his sons or at me for exposing them. The friends and extended family looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, some of them starting to realize they might want to leave. I let the recording end, then calmly moved to the next piece of evidence. I pulled up more photos on the projector, going through them one by one. Bruises on my ribs, my back, my shoulders, a black eye, split knuckles from where I'd tried to defend myself. Each photo was time-stamped and dated. I provided context for each one, my voice still calm and measured. This one was from April 15th, when Marcus cornered me in the garage and hit me repeatedly because I'd asked him to leave. This one was from May 3rd, when Derek held me while Marcus punched me in the ribs. This one was from May 20th, when they brought their friend Tony over, and all three of them beat me. Marcus finally found his voice and shouted that this was bullshit, that I was lying, that this was some kind of setup. I looked at him calmly and told him to sit down and be quiet, that he'd have his chance to deny everything after I was done showing the evidence. The authority in my voice seemed to surprise him. It was so different from the defeated, apologetic tone he was used to, and he actually sat back down, though he was vibrating with rage. I continued with the presentation. I showed text messages from Derek, hundreds of them, ordering me around, mocking me, threatening me. I showed financial records documenting thousands of dollars in unauthorized withdrawals and charges. I played more audio recordings, different incidents, building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse over months. I showed text messages between Jennifer and her brothers, the ones where she laughed about my complaints, where she enabled their behavior, where she made it clear that she sided with them over her own husband. Then I played the video from the incident with Emma. This was the moment that broke the room completely. The footage showed everything. Marcus slamming me against the wall, the picture frame falling, him hitting me, and then Emma's terrified face as she screamed and ran toward us. You could hear her crying, begging Marcus to stop, see her small body physically trying to pull him away from me. You could see the moment when Marcus looked at her with anger, when he seemed on the verge of hitting her, too. You could hear her screaming, "You're bad men," and crying hysterically. You could see her terror, her trauma, the pure fear on the face of an 8-year-old child watching her father being beaten. Linda let out a sob when she saw that. Several other people gasped or made sounds of distress. Jennifer had started crying, though I couldn't tell if it was from guilt or just shock at being exposed. Robert was staring at his sons with an expression I couldn't read. Horror mixed with something else, maybe denial starting to crack. The friends and extended family looked horrified, some of them already standing up, clearly wanting to leave this nightmare they'd stumbled into. I let the video play until it showed Marcus threatening Emma, telling her that her daddy would get it worse if she didn't go to her room, until it showed Emma running away sobbing. Then I stopped it and turned to face the room. I said, "This is what's been happening. For over a year, Marcus and Derek have been coming into this house and abusing me. They've beaten me, threatened me, stolen from me, and terrorized my daughter. And Jennifer," I turned to look at her directly, "you've known about all of it. You've watched it happen. You've laughed along with their jokes. You've enabled every bit of it because your brother's approval is more important to you than your husband's safety or your daughter's well-being." Jennifer tried to speak, tried to say something about not knowing it was that bad, about thinking it was just family dynamics, but I cut her off. I pulled up the text messages between her and her brothers on the projector, the ones where she clearly knew what was happening and chose to enable it. I read them aloud, my voice hard. "Derek texts you, 'Is your husband going to be a little bitch about us coming over tonight?' And you respond, 'Probably, but don't worry. I'll handle it.' Marcus texts you, 'I had to straighten him out last night. He was getting mouthy.' And you respond, 'Thanks. He needed it.'" I looked at her. "You knew you were part of it." Then I turned back to Marcus and Derek and delivered the final blow. "I've already shared all of this evidence with my lawyer, with the police, and with your employers. Marcus, Apex Builders launched an internal investigation into your conduct 3 weeks ago. They've found evidence of workplace violence, safety violations, and intimidation that matches the behavior documented here. You're going to be fired if you haven't been already. Derek, First National Bank opened an ethics inquiry into your conduct 4 weeks ago. They've found evidence of fraudulent practices, kickbacks, and misconduct. You're also going to be fired if you haven't been already. And as of this afternoon, criminal charges have been filed against both of you for assault and battery, multiple counts. Arrest warrants have been issued. The police are outside right now, waiting to take you into custody. Emergency restraining orders have been granted, keeping you away from me, from Emma, and from this house permanently. You're done. Both of you. Your careers are over, your reputations are destroyed, and you're going to face criminal consequences for what you've done." The room erupted. Marcus lunged toward me, his face twisted with rage, shouting obscenities, but he didn't make it 2 steps before Robert and Uncle Mike grabbed him, holding him back. Derek was on his feet too, shouting that this was bullshit, that I'd entrapped them, that none of this would hold up in court. I just looked at him calmly and said, "Everything I've done is legal and documented. You entrapped yourselves. You chose to come into this house night after night. You chose to hit me. You chose to threaten me. You chose to terrorize a child. Every word, every action, every choice was yours. I just documented it." Linda was sobbing openly now, staring at her sons like she didn't recognize them. Jennifer was crying too, but now she was angry, shouting at me, asking how I could do this, how I could destroy her family. I turned to her and said, voice cold, "I didn't destroy your family. Your brothers did that when they decided to beat your husband. And you helped them when you chose to enable it instead of stopping it. You want to blame someone? Look in the mirror." There was pounding on the front door then, and I walked over and opened it. Detective Morrison stood there with 2 uniformed officers. She looked past me into the room, making eye contact with Marcus and Derek, and said clearly, "Marcus Patterson, Derek Patterson, you're under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent." Marcus tried to run. He actually tried to bolt for the back door, but the officers were ready for that, and they intercepted him before he made it out of the living room. He fought them, shouting and struggling, and they had to physically restrain him, forcing his arms behind his back and cuffing his wrists. Derek didn't fight, just stood there, with his hands in the air, his face ashen, as another officer cuffed him. Both men were read their rights while their parents watched in horror, while friends and extended family stood frozen, while Jennifer sobbed in the corner. As they were being led out in handcuffs, Marcus turned to me, his face twisted with rage, and spat out, "You're going to regret this. You don't know what you've started. We'll destroy you. We'll take everything." I looked at him calmly and said, "You already tried to destroy me. For over a year, you tried to break me, to make me feel powerless and worthless. But I'm not your victim anymore, and I'm not my brother anymore either." His face went blank with confusion at that last statement, but before he could process it, the officers pulled him toward the door. They were loaded into police cars and driven away, and suddenly the house was much quieter. Just the soft sound of Linda crying and Jennifer's ragged breathing and people shifting uncomfortably. I turned to the remaining guests and said, I think it's time for everyone to leave. If anyone wants copies of the evidence, for your own understanding of what's been happening, I can provide that. Otherwise, please go. Most people couldn't leave fast enough. The friends and extended family practically fled, offering awkward condolences or apologies or just leaving in shocked silence. Linda approached me before she left, tears streaming down her face, and said, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they were doing this. I looked at her, saw genuine horror and regret in her eyes, and some of my anger softened slightly. I said, maybe you didn't know the extent of it. But there were signs. There were moments when you could have asked questions, could have paid attention, could have wondered why your son-in-law looked increasingly afraid and beaten down. Those signs were there. Everyone chose not to see them. She nodded, crying harder, and left with Robert, who still hadn't said a word. It was just me and Jennifer in the living room. She sat on the couch, her face blotchy from crying, and she looked up at me with something like hatred. How could you? She asked, her voice hoarse. How could you do this to my family? To me? We're going to lose everything because of you. I sat down across from her, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline that had been keeping me going starting to fade. I said, Jennifer, your brothers have been beating your husband for over a year. They terrorized your daughter. They stole money. They turned your home into a place of fear and violence. And you let them. You enabled them. You chose their approval over your family's safety. This didn't happen because of me. This happened because of choices you and your brothers made over and over again. She shook her head, still in denial, and said, but they were just being brothers. They were protecting me, making sure you were treating me right. I let out a bitter laugh. Protecting you from what? From a husband who loved you and wanted to build a life with you? They weren't protecting you, Jennifer. They were controlling you. And they were abusing him. And you let them because it was easier than standing up to them, easier than choosing your husband over your brothers. I stood up then and told her that divorce papers would be filed within the week, that my brother, the real one, because I wasn't going to hide that anymore, would be seeking sole custody of Emma, and that she should get a lawyer. She looked at me in confusion, starting to ask what I meant by the real one. And that's when I decided to tell her the truth. I said, I'm not your husband. I'm his twin brother. He came to me 7 weeks ago, covered in bruises, terrified, broken. He asked me to switch places with him so he could get away and heal. So I stepped into his life, took his place, and I've been living here, taking the abuse he was taking, documenting everything, building a case to destroy the men who were destroying him. Your husband is safe, away from you and your brothers, and he's been healing. And I've been gathering evidence to make sure that Marcus and Derek and you face consequences for what you've done. Everything you've been doing to him for the past 7 weeks, you've been doing to me. Every hit, every insult, every moment of cruelty, I took it for him. And I documented all of it. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally understanding. She whispered, You're his brother? This whole time? I nodded. She said, but you were, everything was, I finished for her. Everything was exactly like him because I studied how he moved, how he talked, how he'd been broken down by you and your brothers. I became him so thoroughly that you never questioned it. That's how broken he was, Jennifer. I could step into his life and play the part of a beaten down, terrified man, and you didn't notice anything different because that's what he'd become. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something break behind her eyes, some final piece of denial shattering. Then she just put her face in her hands and sobbed. I felt no sympathy. I stood up, told her I'd be staying in the house tonight, but she should probably go to her parents' place. And I went upstairs to the guest room I'd been using. Behind me, I heard her crying, but I closed the door and shut it out. It was done. I'd exposed them. I'd set the trap, and they'd walked right into it. Everything else would unfold from here. The legal proceedings, the consequences, the rebuilding. But the hardest part, the dangerous part, where I'd had to take abuse and endure and play a role, that was over. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. I called my brother at the cabin. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety, and asked how it had gone. I told him everything about the dinner, about the evidence, about the reactions, about Marcus and Derek being arrested, about Jennifer's complicity being exposed, about how it was finally over. He was silent for a long moment, And then I heard him crying. Great gasping sobs of relief and release. He said, "Thank you, thank you. I don't know how to ever thank you enough." I told him he didn't need to thank me, that he was my brother, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. I told him to stay at the cabin for a few more days while things settled, and then he could come home, to his new apartment, the one I'd helped him find and set up, far away from this house and Jennifer and her family. He said he would, and we talked for a while longer, processing everything. Both of us exhausted and relieved and still struggling to believe it was really over. After I hung up, I just sat there in the quiet room, feeling the bruises ache, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones, and I let myself breathe. It was done. The nightmare was over. And tomorrow, the real work of healing and justice and rebuilding would begin. But tonight, I just let myself feel the relief of having survived, having succeeded, having protected my brother and niece from the men who'd tried to destroy them. That was enough.